Hello, I'm Ann Hines, and I'm principal at Goshen Post Elementary School in Loudoun County, Virginia. We are a project-based learning wall-to-wall design school, and I'm anxious to talk about our experiences today.
I'm Jim Egenrieder, and I teach engineering education at Virginia Tech, where I also teach in natural resources and the environment in the Center for Leadership for Global Sustainability.
I'm Monique O'Grady, and I am a member of the Arlington Public School Board, and I have 3 children. One is still a student in Arlington Public Schools.
I'm Sam Leitermann-Long. I'm a mathematics teacher at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Potomac, Maryland, and I attended a project-based learning high school, and I'm interested to talk about that.
I'm Paula Lazor, and I'm the author of Beyond the Box, How Hands-On Learning Can Transform a Child and Reform Our Schools. Please join us in conversations.
For me, the key, the thing I look toward in terms of engaging young people is to start them as early as possible in any of those activities that reveal that sense of self, that builds a foundation for self-advocacy, even as early as 3rd and 4th grade.
Well, I've even seen at Goshen Post the importance of beginning that engagement even at kindergarten. You know, it's remarkable how children learn by doing from birth to age 5, but then in traditional schools at age 5 we would bring them to school and sit them in rows and hand worksheets, and it would be more of a sit and get mentality, and we would stop all of that authentic learning. And so by us looking at this project-based learning design method of instruction, it ensures that that deeper learning is occurring even when children are 5 and 6 years old.
Well, and I think we do a little bit of a disservice to kids by assuming that 5 or 6 is too young to be deeply involved in your learning, right? 5 or 6 year olds aren't maybe going to solve the problems of climate change, but they might think about how the sun and the water cycle works. And they certainly can get a grasp on that. And if that's super exciting to them, why are we going to spend a ton of time looking at a diagram of how that works instead of spending some time thinking about how it works and going outside and spending time? So one of the things that project-based learning really engages in is not assuming the least of students, but assuming the most of students. And that, I think that's a little bit of what we're talking about with engagement. We're assuming they can engage with something deeply and they are interested in something deeply. I think that's incredibly important.
And Sam, I would just add that we can go even younger than that. I know in Arlington we have one of the first public Montessori programs in the country, and we bring children in at age 3. And we give them the opportunity to go and pick out challenging work on the shelf that they're interested in doing. They learn how to do it, and then eventually they can teach another child their experience. And just having that engagement, having that tactile opportunity to touch something, to learn something, to collaborate with a friend, and to work with someone who's older, and to get their friendship and their guidance, and that citizenship can help a child learn, even at 3. And so this idea of experience is a great foundation for learning, and we know that with our youngest children. So we can continue to build on it for older students, but we can look to some of our youngest learners to know that being engaged is a great way to learn.
Absolutely.
And how are they learning? Through playing. And playing is hands-on. I mean, that's from the very beginning. And to see with that playfulness, that joy, and that joy of learning, which I think we all would love to see in all of our children.
I wonder how, especially in your project-based learning schools, your definition of inquiry has evolved, where it used to be sort of that I do, we do, you do, and how it's evolved to something much more like, here's a tool, let's develop this skill. What are you going to do with your new tools and skills? And I'm really curious about an aquaculture school,
Right.
how it would evolve there.
By allowing our children to facilitate the learning, to own their own learning experience, and the teacher guiding them through that experience has just been tremendously powerful because they're invested. Especially with a project-based learning experience where they're solving a challenging problem or investing in a community affair that needs to be solved or to support. And so there's investment with those children. And when there's investment, that's when that sustained inquiry continues, because one experience leads into another experience, and it's not a lesson that's one and done. It just evolves and it continues, and that's where that deeper learning experience occurs. So it's not as traditional learning where students learn and then they may forget a day or two later, but this is embedded in their purpose for learning, and so it's sustainable, right? It's sustainable learning and incorporated around soft skills. And so when children are engaged, and when we're engaged, even as adults, we continue to ask questions, and then the learning continues. It's just the pedagogy shift for educators is something that they need to be ready to embrace and take that risk.
I also think that it's incredibly important the way you phrased it, which is that first we give you a tool. Because what we know about inquiry-based learning is that if we don't give you the tools to inquire, then all you do is spend your time in a miasma of confusion. So there's necessarily some amount of instruction. There's necessarily some amount of giving a tool to use. The trick is, what do you do with the tool afterwards? And what I like hearing here is a sense of authenticity, because as a math teacher, I can come up with a series of inauthentic activities for you to practice multiplication on. That's an easy task for me. But when students spend a time finding an authentic challenge that they care about, that's when those tools become real to them and they become useful. And that's when they also use those tools again and again. And we know that learning sticks when you don't just use the tool immediately after it was taught, but you use it on the next challenge and the next challenge and the next challenge. So you have to remember it again and again and again. And that's a lot of what inquiry looks like for us, is that sense of seeking authenticity, seeking a challenge that means something to you, instead of means something to your teacher, or maybe doesn't mean something to your teacher, it's just something they've come up with.
As a math teacher, do you get to arrive at an authentic product as well? That seems like it would be a challenge in a math classroom.
That's an interesting question, because the answer is sometimes. And the answer is that students need to define what authenticity means for them. So most of my students are not going to model the US economy. It's just, that is a huge problem. But they might come up with a reasonable working model of the US economy, or at least one that gives them some insight into the US economy. And when they recognize that they've arrived at a place and that place has limitations and they should acknowledge them and understand what they can't understand from this model, but also acknowledge what they can understand from this model, that's an enormous, enormous learning opportunity, because all models mathematically are limited. And so just learning the limitations of that sense of authenticity is huge for them. It's a great thing for them to have as an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what struck me when you were saying about what they can and what they can't understand, the one, I have a radio show as well as the book, and the show deals with the multiple ways of learning. And throughout the programs, I've had a lot of students from the Arlington Public Schools talking about the various career and technical education classes that they've had. And one of the things that struck me among them is that they're not afraid to question, and they're not afraid to fail, because it's just part of life is to not always have the right answer, but that doesn't mean you give up. You pursue. And I think one of the problems with the traditional system, I think, is because there still seems to be so much of an emphasis on tests that if you don't pass your test, you've somehow failed. And to some degree, and in the book that I wrote, my son, through the traditional system, had developed a lot of school anxiety. And I know a lot of children have that, whether it's test, math anxiety. But I think if we could somehow instill in our children the joy of learning versus the fear of failing.
Make better mistakes tomorrow rather than that no mistakes environment that
Exactly.
testing creates.
Paula, I have an example to kind of talk about one of the ways that we use project-based learning in Arlington, and it's in Arlington Tech, which is a portion of the Career Center. There was a project that was brought to students. How do we help this young child who has some mobility issues? They took, those cars that are battery-operated cars. They retrofitted a car like that for a child, made a space for the child's oxygen tank, worked with the auto tech lab to paint it up and add an emblem on it for Superman, because this child was a fan of Superman, and created this ability for a child who had some difficulties with getting around, the ability to be able to ride in this car. And he rolled it out, he came out in his cape, and the students were so proud that they were able to change, adapt a car for a child, give it the paint job and the emblem, using the laser cutter, so that they could own the experience. They use the 5 C's. They use communication. They use collaboration. They use critical thinking. They use citizenship, and they use communication to be able to figure out how to solve this problem for a child in our community. And I feel like each of them is forever changed for that, because they know that even as a high schooler, they had the opportunity to have a huge impact on a child's life. And they didn't do that by taking a test. They did that by using all of those 5C skills to make a difference. And I think that's incredibly empowering for a student. And I think it's great for students to learn that they have what it takes within themselves to change their community. They have within themselves the ability to be able to come up with the answers without it being fed to them first. So, project-based learning does so much for our children, and so I'm excited that we're on that journey here in Arlington from our elementary schools all the way up through high schools to give our children the opportunity to have that moment where they understand that they can change something, and we don't have to feed it to them. It's in them. Give them the ability to show it.
You reminded me of the road trip analogy to education, where somehow we've got in this destination-oriented mode where it's all about graduation or the big exam or those big milestones rather than the journey, which is how I was reminded. And when you think about the projects, they're sort of the restaurant you stopped at that you wouldn't have stopped at if you were in a hurry. And maybe even you remember the conversations you had at the restaurant. And when we start to think about education as a journey or an exploration, that's, I think, when we've really got students hooked on their own learning and real inquiry.
I'm thinking that this truly is a national reform, right, in education. And I know in Arlington and in Loudoun County, it is a vision of our superintendent that every single school establishes a project-based learning framework. Some schools more so than others. At Goshen Post, ours is a wall-to-wall PBL school. But nationally, we're seeing that corporate world is looking for those students, like you were mentioning, about those soft skills and being able to collaborate. And it seems in the traditional world, we would have graduates that would come out and work in silos, and that grit and perseverance wasn't there. And we're really seeing that those C skills, the collaborating, being creative, and being able to think through and persevere, are critical to the success. So many times, and I'm not from Northern Virginia, but I'm thankful that I've lived here for the last 10 years, but we often speak of our high test scores. And I know, we're blessed to have groups of students that score very well, whether it be Fairfax or Loudoun or Arlington. But yet what we really need to concentrate on, are they able to apply those skills? It's not a binary world, right? And so if in what we tell our students at Goshen, if we're not able to work with one another and to be able to collaborate and solve problems, filling in a blank will not cause us to succeed in this world. And so with a PBL mentality, which leads us into a performance-based assessment mentality of being able to apply what we know with real, authentic assessments, we are going to see gaps close, students be engaged, discipline go down. I truly feel PBL is the equalizer in education. And when we speak of equity in our schools, then we need to ensure that the framework of instruction is present for all of our children.
Do you use group work in your projects?
Yes, we do.
Regularly, all the time, most of the time?
We use group work, but children are also assessed individually. At our school, we have a dimmer switch approach, which means part of the day is used for direct instruction. And we have not compromised that because there are a set of skills that children need to support the PBL experiences. So part of our day is a dimmer switch with our math workshops and our reading blocks. But then the other portion of the day is all gold standard 8-element PBL, wall to wall. And there has to be a consistent, ongoing PBL, not one a quarter, not one a semester, but every single day. They're invested in PBL with community members coming in our own community across the nation. But our discipline reports have decreased dramatically, because it engages all students.
I'm interested in that because when you look at PBL approaches, particularly as they've been implemented in the past, and PBL is a changing field, so it's hard to pin down, we know two things. We know, first of all, that direct instructions for some things is way more effective, and I think that's a good point. But also that students on the lower end of the achievement gap have, in some cases, been failed by PBL or felt that PBL hasn't led to a rise in achievement as the same as their higher achieving peers. So what's the solution there? How do we make PBL work for all students, not just the students that are going to get skill instruction at home, that are going to have parents that make sure their skills are up to par if they don't quite catch it in the classroom? How do you, I'm interested, make sure that those students who might miss it and then be lost in the project-based part of their day don't get lost?
Our children don't get lost in their PBL portion of the day. Our children with special needs thrive in their PBL portion of the day because it's hands-on. It's authentic, it's meaningful. They're able to make an impact to their community, so they're invested and engaged. We have not seen that. We do have the direct instruction to make sure in a blended learning, personalized learning approach. But truly, our students with specific educational challenges, they're thriving because the first time they're not giving a worksheet where they fill in a blank and teachers stand at the front of the room. They're actually working with their partners and engaging. We have a grade level right now working on electrical circuits, and so all of our students are out building circuits and engaging on dimmer lights and low lights, and students are working with one another. Where we'll lose students is by not creating an environment with authentic learning.
Well, I wonder about group size then. Is that where the students might be getting lost if there are more than 3 in a group? Or
I think there's a lot of pieces, and this might actually speak to teacher training here. So we may move that direction because grouping by ability level is a part here, right? If students get grouped so that students that are struggling get grouped into one group and students that are doing well get grouped in another group, that's a piece that can leave students behind. There's a lot of pieces to project-based learning that all need to be in place to make this happen. And so it's hard to pin down whether failures of project-based learning have been failures of the theory or they've been failures of the implementation. And so, and the support and all the training. And so I wonder, how do we make group size and grouping in an appropriate way and the appropriate amount of direct instruction? What are the best practices here that lead to those outcomes? Because there's so many different moving pieces here.
Right. I remember I was leading the master naturalists in study of ecology for their certification, and I had them break up into small groups of 2 or 3, and I said no groups of 1, and didn't think about it until out in the parking lot a woman pulled me aside and said, "I am so glad you encourage group work. I work with medical doctors, and some of those people were those young students where the teacher would say, I'd like everybody to work in groups, except for you, Paula. You can work alone." Because the teacher might have assumed Paula was just too far ahead of us to and would be bored with us. So as a result, that now doctor never really developed some of those essential skills of being a doctor, like bedside manner and being nice to the nurses and other staff that surround them. And anyway, it got me thinking that that group work also moves in multiple directions or contributes to many different things beyond the obvious, just talking.
One of my favorite stories here is about 3 Mile Island. There's a story about 3 Mile Island and the aftermath, where they share that people knew that that disaster was going to happen. But a lot of engineers wrote a lot of reports that a lot of executives didn't read or couldn't read because they didn't have the soft skills to communicate that this was happening. And so maybe a lot of those engineers got to be groups of one, and that might have been a problem.
Silo.
I would just say I'm so glad you brought up teacher training, Sam, because I do think teacher training is important. We're talking about the difference between, teacher-directed and child-centered learning. And I think when I was in school, way back when, our teachers really were taught to stand in front of the class and to tell us what we needed to know, and we were taught to regurgitate that, right? And to show that we could write that on a test. I think it's important that if we're going to really take project-based learning seriously, that our teachers have the skill to be able to give the students what they need and then stand back and let them go. And without that training, I think we could potentially, Jim, leave kids behind. I think we could potentially not really effectuate what we're trying to do, which is to engage kids in learning. And I'm not sure what the right group number is. I'm not sure of all the different pieces that the teacher needs to be looking out for to ensure that every child is learning. Maybe Sam, you might know better, but I do think that training can help. And that is going to be part of what we're offering in Arlington as well, giving our teachers the opportunity to learn more about project-based learning and get that training so that we can incorporate it across all of our schools, not just Arlington Tech, not just Drew Model School, for which they're starting out as a brand new neighborhood school, full neighborhood school. And for the last few years, they've been training up their teachers to continue to offer a project-based learning model. We have other schools in Arlington that are STEM and STEAM and are also incorporating project-based learning. But eventually, all of our students will have the opportunity for their teachers to have that training and to feel that. I was just recently, earlier this month, at a program called Dream, Explore, Create. And we brought students in from all across Arlington, and I brought my son along, who's a freshman, and one of the first activities was one maybe that you have done, Sam, or you have done in your school, Anne, where kids were asked to build a tower out of spaghetti and tape, and to take one of those big fat marshmallows you might see at a campfire and build it and be able to ensure that the tower can hold a marshmallow at the top. And it was incredible to see kids who didn't know each other coming up with all different ways to make that tower happen and to keep that marshmallow suspended high. And they didn't necessarily know each other, but they were able to work together to make that happen. And the joy and the different examples of some that looked like the Eiffel Towers and some that looked a little different. And but the excitement of seeing the kids do that and try, and it was fun for the kids. And a lot of those soft skills, I should say, and the creativity, the collaboration, the communication, the citizenship of, okay, I can listen to you now, and I think all of those things are important. And so making sure that we have the teachers trained so that they can enhance that and not get in the way, I think can make classrooms so much more exciting.
I'm curious though, how, if you're starting the project-based learning in all the schools, there is this transition for the teachers. And being that you are involved in this day to day, how is that done to have the teachers learning while they're also trying to teach with that?
Right, and you brought up a really valid point that we're fortunate in Loudoun that we have really strong supports and structures in place. It's a systems issue, truthfully, because it really would be detrimental if you sent your teachers off to teach in a project-based learning method without that type of training. And so our teachers at Goshen have been trained. They've had many full days of training, and the Buck Institute from out on the West Coast has helped support our schools, and now we have our own instructional facilitators that are project-based learning trained, and so they've trained our entire staff. And then every single month we have professional development at our school for about 2 hours after school. And so our teachers continue with that training throughout each month. I personally meet with the Department of Instruction every month, and we review all of the elements. Our teachers once a month have project-based learning walks, where they use documents where they go into other classrooms and they're looking for specific elements in PBL best teaching practices, and they're able to give immediate feedback to teachers. It is a conversation that continues, but I will say as a school-based leader, one has to keep that vision tight because there's many wonderful frameworks of instruction. STEM is one, but STEM is mostly a one and done. Right? It's a one and done. It doesn't really necessarily have an authentic purpose. But what is wonderful about PBL is you can incorporate STEM into your PBL experiences, but you have to keep that vision because teachers, when they become fatigued, they'll slip back into the traditional teaching. And so it's really important as a principal that I hold them up and support them and give them the training they need. It's also important that you hire the right teachers that are progressive, are ready to take that risk, aren't fearful to fail. If we have teachers that are afraid to fail, then how can we expect our students not to move forward? But intense professional development really is critical for a county school and classroom to move forward. And without doing so, you're going to sabotage the efficacy of PBL.
I was not aware that you had direct instruction.
Yes.
As part of your school
We call it
day.
a dimmer switch, right?
And I started project-based learning back in the late 90s. And back then, all the folks who became the Buck Institute of Education were at Autodesk Foundation. And I went to their conference, and I got really enthused about this. And then back in about 2004, I went to Buck Institute of Education for a summer. And when I came back, we started trying to implement project-based learning throughout Arlington, especially in career and tech ed. And what we discovered is there were a lot of great projects already underway, but nobody was doing an even bigger job of tying all the projects together. And that's where direct instruction can really play a role. So I think that's a necessary component of the teacher professional development too. Maybe simply tying in backwards design or the education form of that is understanding by design by Wiggins and McTighe.
As we begin to wrap up, I think I just wanted to say that we do have some leader schools in Arlington that are going to be using project-based learning. I think all of our teachers will have the opportunity to be able to get some training so that they can incorporate some part of project-based learning into their curriculum, even if that is not the focus of their school. So we're trying to figure out a way to engage all of our students, even if every school is not project-based learning themed, giving teachers some of those tools so they can incorporate them into certain classes.
Well, I think what I'm hearing actually from all three of your responses is that it's about building community. And that community might be wall-to-wall PBL, it might not be wall-to-wall PBL, but it's all built around people that have the right training and the right mindset towards engaging students and using the right techniques. And as you said, there's a lot of techniques, and they might include PBL and not, but once you build that community, once you hire the right people, once you train them all at the same time so they all know the path we're on, that's when you get school success. PBL or not PBL, that's how you get school success, but PBL only enhances that community, and that's a huge piece. It's what I hear is happening in Arlington, it's what I hear is happening in Lawton County, and that's amazing to hear.
Isn't that the point of education too, to develop children who do care, that want to be responsible citizens?
It's difficult to have project-based learning without empathy. They really go hand in hand.
Well, because to identify problems, you have to
That's right.
think about from someone. If you only ever identify your own problems, then you're probably going to have a pretty boring life, right? You have to think about from somebody else's perspective what the problems might look like. And if you don't have empathetic kids, or you're not building empathetic kids, then you're not
Yeah.
building kids that can do project-based learning. And
Wow.
That's huge.
Wow, we started with project-based learning and we ended with empathy. This is a great conversation.